Got tight hips? We've got a stretch for that. Today we're going to take a look at the couch stretch. The couch stretch is actually a stretch for your quads and hip flexors, not so much for the hip, but it's going to help with hips and low back and everything in the surrounding area. We want to look at this because we spend so much time sitting and at our desks, in a chair, in a car, that our quads and our hip flexors are actually shortening up, tightening around the hip capsule. And so what we want to do is try and lengthen those out. But we want to do so without harming the smaller structures of the hip. So how are we going to set up for this? Now, normally when we try and stretch out our hips, we get into this deep lunge, we push our hip forward. We don't want to do that. Avoid that, because what you're doing is putting stress on the smaller structures within the hip, the ligaments, the tendons, everything that's supposed to hold it into place. What you want to do is set up so that your knee is directly under your pelvis, and then squeeze your butt, try and tuck your hips under to open up the front of the hip and stretch those structures in the front. Why do we want to do this? Imagine, or don't imagine, let's go through a little bit of anatomy. The femur, your upper leg bone, sits in the pelvis. So we have the head of our femur that sits in our pelvis and kind of a ball and socket type joint. So from the side view, we have the head of the femur, the pelvis. Now, as we push forward into that lunge, we're tilting the pelvis back and pushing the head of the femur out, creating this gap between the two. We don't want to create that gap. What that does is it's putting a lot of stress and strain and creating some micro tears on all the smaller ligaments and muscles that are in charge of keeping that femur head inside the pelvis. It wants to sit inside the pelvis. That's where it needs to be. Stop pushing forward and stretching that out. All you're doing is harming the smaller structures of the hip. So keep the pelvis on top of the knee, tuck the butt under, and try and open the hip up that way. If this isn't a deep enough stretch for you, then we can get our tools. We can get a wall, a box, a couch, and make this a deeper stretch by putting our foot up on the wall and scooting our knee back as close to the wall while keeping the pelvis on top of the knee to get a deeper stretch. So what that looks like, I'm going to put my foot up against the wall. My pelvis is still right atop my knee, and I'm squeezing my butt, trying to tuck my butt under to open up the front of the hip, stretching out the quads, stretching out the hip flexors while keeping the femur in a good position to protect all the smaller ligaments, muscles, tendons inside the hip. Get a nice open stretch while staying healthy. That's your mobility tip for this week. We'll see you guys next week as we look at something else to stretch.